Welcome back, everyone. Hope you're all suitably refreshed. Good snacks and great coffee, always a sign of a very good conference. Right, this session is... Actually, I've just met the lovely Phoebe O'Hara, so you got a treat in store. Our next session will provide critical insights into the profound changes in both the European and global EV markets. To break it all down is the lovely Phoebe O'Hara. Welcome up.
Hello, that was the loveliest introduction I've ever had. I might need that every morning before I go to work. Hi everybody, it's so lovely to have you here. To those I haven't met before, my name is Phoebe O'Hara. I'm a senior analyst on the battery raw materials team. Predominantly I've been leading the demand side. I'm now in a new role looking at energy storage systems. We've just launched our new report as of yesterday, which was super exciting. And just to say at the outset, if any of you have any questions at all, please feel free to come and find me. I really love a chat. So today we're going to be looking at our demand outlook. And I wanted to frame the session by really putting as a forefront of our minds the big question, which I think everybody in the industry and the media is talking about. Is it all collapsing? Is the dream fading? And the reason that we're having this conversation is because we're seeing negative sentiment at what I call both ends of the spectrum. And this goes back to what Anita was saying earlier about the kind of upward trend of EV adoption. The way that I would frame it is by saying that you've got your leaders and laggards of EV adoption. And sadly, both ends of that spectrum are really struggling to showcase strong growth. And that's leaving us with a lot of uncertainty. So if we look at the data on the left-hand side, we can see Norway there only had 3.1% of growth year on year last year. February of this year, we saw a 9.2% decline in China. And then the other end, the kind of laggards, the new adopters as well, are seeing slow growth. So Korea, we actually saw a decline in EV sales last year. And February of this year, we saw only 1% year-on-year growth for BEVs in the States. Now, that's leaving us with a feeling that there's no strong growth anywhere. And what I would actually say is that's making us be really short-termists, and we're really obscuring ourselves from understanding what the long-term outlook is. So the reason why I'm saying this is, number one, we believe that there's steady growth and really strong fundamentals for strong battery demand. Number two, this kind of negativity is really obscuring some of the newer growth stories that we're really excited about. For me, that's places like India, some of the emerging markets where there's really strong policy being introduced. And then lastly, we're clouding our awareness of what the key drivers actually are for battery demand. What are the key things that we're looking at that are pushing the story forward? And can we understand where some of the tensions are emerging there? So, how am I going to break this presentation down? If you've seen me before, you're going to be bored. It's going to be 3 classic breakups. Number one, we're going to look at what Fastmarkets thinks. What growth are we expecting over the next decade? And we're expecting that to accelerate, particularly towards the 2030s, as we're seeing the renewable energy story gather pace. Number two, I'm going to go into those drivers. Particularly, we're going to be talking about why prices, charging points, and consumer psychology are the short-term risks that we need to be looking out for. And then we're going to be looking more at the long term, the story that I'm most excited about and that gets me up in the morning. Why I think that the growth story over the 2030s is what we need to be looking towards even more so than the short-termist, alarmist conversation that we're having in the industry right now. So, to start out with, thinking about battery demand generally, we're thinking that it's going to grow at a steady rate and that emerging markets are showing some of the strongest growth rates. So, if I start with a long-term outlook, you can see on the graph on the left-hand side, Fastmarkets' view for EV battery demand. We believe it's going to reach just above 4 terawatt-hours by 2034, showing a CAGR of 15%. So if we think about that as terms of a general growth rate, that is showing pretty strong growth, okay? And if we break down that graph on the left-hand side, unsurprisingly, we're seeing the largest market share put out by China. But if we look out to 2034, the thing that I find most exciting is that diversification of colors. You know, if you look at the top right-hand side of that bar for 2034, the immediate and rapid growth of places like India, South Korea, and also the rest of the world. Those are the places where we're going to see most rapid growth in the near term, and we should be kind of bolstering some of those stories as we have this conversation. Now, if we split that out by sector, where exactly is that demand coming from? Unsurprisingly, again, we're seeing EVs take the lion's share of that demand out to 2034. But the area, unsurprisingly, and I'm obviously a little bit biased as the lead analyst for energy storage, the area that I really want to highlight to everybody in the audience is energy storage systems. We're incredibly bullish on this segment. We believe that it currently has a CAGR of 22%. I would highlight that I think that's actually going to grow with our new forecasts coming out in the next couple of months. And we believe that it's going to reach 70% of total demand by 2034. Other areas to highlight, again, which are showing really strong growth, consumer electronics remaining kind of largely flat. It's a very well-developed market. Battery swaps is something I would really highlight. It's a technology that's been in the market for some time, but we're really seeing that being accelerated by OEMs in China and actually translated into Europe with some of NIO and other Chinese OEMs' work. So I would advance to look there. Another smaller subsector that isn't included because it's a lot smaller on that graph, but one I would highlight is data centers. We're all probably aware of the huge amounts of lithium-ion batteries required to support data centers, and that's something that we also include in our analysis for the full demand figure. So we're expecting that strong growth outside the decade, and this is despite what we're seeing recently. So you can see on the graph on the left-hand side some of the EV penetration rate figures and forecasts that we have for fast markets. And the reason why I'm showing this graph is to showcase why I'm excited about some of the smaller, more emerging markets. What we've seen is that the strongest leaders, such as Norway, which has the highest EV penetration rates, actually post some of the slowest year-on-year growth rates. And that's because in these markets, if we take Norway as a great example, where we've seen strong adoption from some consumers who were really keen to have an EV, we've seen that kind of cater off and get to the bit of the market which is difficult to either persuade or difficult to buy in with an affordable model. The areas where we are seeing stronger growth rates in Europe, though, and the ones for me that are more exciting are places like France, instituting really interesting subsidy policy for people in local cities and for people on low to middle income to get access to EVs. Simultaneously, Central and Eastern Europe, really at the early stages of bringing policy and affordable EVs to market. Places like Poland, for example, we saw 40% year-on-year growth rate last year. Europe, I would say, is probably the most difficult region at the moment for EV sales. So the fact that these places are posting 40 to 49% growth rates is still quite exciting. And I think we need to believe in the long-term nature of the story in order to support these markets, to get access to the drivers that they need to improve their market outlook. And I'm going to come to some of these now. So we're going to start with some of the short-term areas that we need to kind of ameliorate and be aware of. But also then we're going to look in my part 3 to some of the more long-term stories that we need to also keep hope onto, basically. So this is something that I always include. I call them my 5 Ps, which is, I didn't just do that because my name is Phoebe, that would be quite narcissistic. But this is my way of kind of making it easy for me to remember what I think of as the key drivers for EV adoption. So on the left, you've got what right now I consider is kind of weighing us to the downside, okay? So we've got prices. For me, the big one there is EV and affordability. Policy, there are some key leading countries, the UK, Norway, Germany, great examples in Europe, who have removed policy and that's kind of limited the amount of EV uptake. And then we've also got psychology, which is a really difficult area for both people in the supply chain and policymakers more broadly to engage with. However, there are drivers to the right-hand side, which I think are kind of bolstering demand and the ability for EVs and adoption to be beneficial and benevolent. We've got PEV chemistry, and then we've also got charging points, which in a lot of markets have shown pretty strong growth over the last year. So I'm going to start out with prices. My argument always is that if we have affordable EVs in this marketplace, EV adoption will grow. And the problem with Europe is that this is the region in which EVs are most expensive. And you can see that on the graph on the left-hand side. So what we've done here is mark for the first half of last year, which is the most recent data we have, is showing an average EV price with a small dot in different regions, and then average annual income. And the gap that you can see there is a showcase of the inaffordability of an EV to the average consumer in a region. And what we can see in Europe is that gap is the widest and by a pretty far margin. When we also look at the amount of price variation in EVs over time, so how much they've fallen, we also see that EV prices have actually gone up. So for Europe, they've increased by 20% year on year on average. China, unsurprisingly, they've dropped due to the economies of scale there. And the US, they've also gone up by 7% year on year. With these factors at play, the key question here, without a question, is that we need to get affordable EVs into this marketplace. And I would highlight there's a great roundtable going on at the end of the day, a champagne roundtable nonetheless, discussing how we make EVs affordable in Europe that I would strongly advise everybody goes to if they're interested. Where do we find affordable models? We know where that is, and that is China. And the research that we've done for Europe specifically is showcased by the graph on the left-hand side. So what we looked at was trying to understand what the new breadth of tariffs introduced into the European market, what implication that's going to have on Chinese EV models. So I'm hoping you can see in the purple we have the original price, and in the yellow we have the price with the tariff put on. And what you can see across the breadth is that the yellow kind of bars remain broadly on par with some of the vehicle offerings of European OEMs, meaning that despite the breadth of models that China offers, their cars are still going to be largely on par in terms of price with Europe. As a result, we don't think that Chinese EV sales are going to have a market impact in terms of how much lower the tariff will make their sales in the region. The only area I would highlight there to be a potential issue is in the latter end of the luxury vehicle segment, where there's definitely more competition. So generally, China should be offering more affordable EVs to the market. It is remiss that the tariffs have heightened that price, but that's the case that we're dealing with. The other upside I would offer is the discussion that we're having right now around extended range electric vehicles. So we've seen this discussion enter the marketplace over the last couple of months. We've seen a lot of OEMs discuss the fact that they're offering this extended range plug-in hybrid. And what we've got on the right-hand side is a chart showcasing the leading OEMs who have said they're going to be offering those EREVs, in short, and the regions through which they're going to be putting them into the market. Unsurprisingly, once again, China is kind of leading this charge with the most advanced technology. And why we think this is going to be good. This is going to ameliorate some of those consumer concerns around range, while also keeping costs lower than, let's say, a full battery electric vehicle. So with these being brought to market over the next 3 years, we believe that could really bolster demand and sales for EVs, starting out in China, and that will, as it typically does, trickle into Europe and the US in terms of other regional sales. Charging points. I think last year the conversation was that we just don't have enough, and it's really terrifying how slow the uptake has been. I think actually when we look at growth over the last year, we've seen really strong uptake and development in Europe, and that's been bolstered particularly by really strong local and national policies. What I've done is showcase a graph on the left-hand side to showcase this growth. So you can see in the, I'm quite proud of this work actually, the lovely kind of hues of color I've got on the left-hand side there. What that's showcasing is an EV to charging point ratio. We like to say that you want in a country an EV to charging point ratio of minimum 10 to 1 in order for an EV fleet to be properly supported, but also to enable local consumers to feel like there's enough chargers locally for them to buy an EV. And if we look at that breadth of numbers, we can see that Asia is leading the charge for the most developed charging networks. And as we move more westerly across into Northern Europe, we can see that those ratios actually fall to a point through which that network cannot support the EVs in those markets. So for an example, Europe, as an average, we see a charging ratio of 22 EVs per charging point. And then the US, even worse, a 31 EVs per charging point ratio. There are differences and kind of particulars and nuances per market in terms of consumers requiring public charging points versus private. But on the whole, we would argue that all of these regions need to invest more heavily and grow their charging fleets as much as possible. I would advertise, though, that Europe has done a really good job over the last year to kind of stymie those investments in growth. What you can see on the right-hand side is also some residual after effects of this kind of charge anxiety coming to the fore with consumers. What you can see there in the purple is BEV sales for Q1 of this year versus plug-in hybrids. Many of you will have seen this conversation in the marketplace, but we've actually seen a massive growth in plug-in hybrid sales of the last year. And you can see that in the yellow across the regions. So China, over 80% growth. US, massive growth there. Western Europe, not as much, actually. And that's really interesting to me for a few reasons. Number one, I think that speaks to the story we've just had about charging points. We're seeing that charge anxiety and a lot of consumer psychology and market reports actually go down in Europe. And I think it also speaks to the fact that OEMs in this market have really bolstered and supported a strong fleet of battery electric vehicles to come to market. And that's the kind of regional differences that we're seeing. So yeah, for charging points, strong adopters, Nordics and Belgium, Eastern Europe, those are the charging networks that we need to see more growth. Consumer psychology. This is actually one of my favorite ones. Oh, I'm really outing myself to be quite unique there. Well, some of my favorite things to read is actually some of the brilliant consumer psychology and market reports put out by a lot of agencies. I'm looking at Nicola over there. McKinsey does a really great one on consumer kind of data points and networks, interviewing consumers directly on their thoughts on electric vehicles. And what we've actually seen for Europe over the last year is pretty positive. What we've seen is that one of their McKinsey reports from 2 years ago was really highlighting the fact that most of EV purchasers were very early adopters. They were really keen on the climate, really pro-sustainability, and they were the key people buying EVs. The shift that we've now seen, actually, with people being interviewed, is that a lot of these people are not just high earners, but they're actually middle-income earners. And we're seeing that made possible by the fall in EV prices. The key thing that is being discussed there is that breadthening of the models available and consumers' reflection on the fact that they actually don't need to be people who are super keen on climate change and preventing that, but they can actually be people who just want a really nice car that's on par with an ICE. So that's a positive thing for us to take away here. However, when we do look at the results of that study and that survey, the key things that come out, they're all pretty on par. Number one is high purchase prices, so EV inaffordability. Second is an insufficient battery driving range. I would argue there that that's misaligned. I actually think the concern there is not really about range anxiety, it's about charge anxiety. I think if consumers were seeing charging points around, I don't think they would worry as much about their range anxiety. And the last one there is battery lifetime. Again, I think that's a bit correlated with the range anxiety piece that will be changed over time through education. So for me, the key one there is affordability. The key outtake for me as well in the short term, when we think about the narratives and the kind of issues that we're facing with demand, is something all to do with policy. And I think really great examples of this is Germany. So if we look at the EV policy on the top left-hand side, we've seen the dropping of the PHEV subsidies at the beginning of 2023 have a really marked impact in total EV sales. Simultaneously, the fantastic Conservative government of the United Kingdom, where I'm from, removed the EV tax subsidy at a very early stage in the UK's adoption journey. And although the market's doing fairly well in terms of growth rates, we've kind of missed that rapid acceleration that markets like Norway foresaw for so long. By contrast, however, we do have some really exciting places which are instituting policies, like I said, for low to middle income. So France, a really exciting policy for low-income buyers, something that we would like to see rolled out far more across the European Union. And then two other policies that I think, actually the policy space which I think is most exciting right now is in energy storage. So the German ministry and also in the UK instituting really kind of first of their kind policies looking at promoting storage deployment, and then in the UK for long duration. So how are we storing energy, not just over the next couple of hours, but maybe over the next couple of months? So that's some really exciting policy that's driving innovation in the market. So yes, in the short term, we have some issues: affordability, consumer psychology, and charging points. However, when I look over the long term, I'm really excited by the upside risks that we're being faced with policy, chemistry, and what that's going to do to demand. However, I am going to start with something that it would be remiss of me not to mention, given that we are fast markets and we have the clarity on this. Something that I don't think is being spoken about none at all in the ESS space, but not really in the EV space in terms of how it relates to battery cost, is the long-term outlook that we're seeing for battery raw materials and their pricing. So what you can see on the graph on the left-hand side is an amalgamation of my brilliant team's metals forecasts for the markets over the next decade. And what you can see, as Anita has echoed and as Raju spoke about this morning, is that we are seeing notable deficits out to the 2030s. We need to be aware of this in the sense of what that's going to do to battery costs, okay? So there's been a massive investment into NCM high nickel, as an example. So OEMs looking to increase their energy density while reducing the risks available to them through cobalt and the typical issues that we find with that metal. Now, what we can see on the graph on the right-hand side, which was provided by my brilliant colleague Krishna, who does our battery cost indexing, is that actually we don't see cell costs going down over the next decade. I'm sure many of you have seen some kind of classic trajectories where we see them going down with the learning rate. That's not what we're seeing at fast markets, okay? There's a key issue here with raw material deficits driving up the potential for those cell costs to increase. So yes, while over time those learning rates and the economies of scale are going to be reached by battery production, something we really need to have in the back of our mind is there is potential volatility going forward, and we need to bake that in terms of understanding how EV uptake is going to respond if cell costs go up with it. Something I'm going to go through quite quickly. I'm really happy to speak to everybody about this separately, and actually Nicolo's going to do a brilliant presentation on this later today. Yes, brilliant. There is such an amazing array of battery chemistries coming to market that is making it easier for EVs to be more affordable, but also to ameliorate some of the earlier issues I spoke about with consumer psychology. So some of the ones I would highlight on the right-hand side, our most recent update for battery demands, we had a massive surge in terms of our personal outlook for LMFP and the potential that that holds. And the reason for that is that we're seeing massive investment from the Chinese OEMs in LMFP. CATL is a great example with their cell reaching 255 watts per kilogram, which when you compare that to an LFP is very substantial. We're then looking at LFP, and even there we're seeing massive acceleration in terms of the energy densities offered there. Goshen, I've kind of put up there as a great example. NCM high nickel I did just speak about. Again, a higher energy density offering, so ameliorating some of those issues in terms of range anxiety for consumers. And then lastly, solid state, something I've been looking into a lot recently. It has come to market far quicker, I would argue, than we kind of thought possible from China over the last couple of months. So we've seen WeLine really leading that charge, and also some other providers offering already to market kind of semi-solid state. That's going to really alter the ways in which OEMs can build a car and in terms of the range that they can offer, and that's a really exciting story. My favorite area, and one I could talk about for hours, but I'm going to really rapidly fire through them. ESS, I think, is the industry that is going to provide us with much of the excitement to supplant some of the negativity in the EV space. So this is a brand new forecast that we've instituted as part of our report. We're expecting global annual ESS installations to peak at just below 1.4 terawatt hours by 2034, and I would argue actually there's massive upside to that forecast. Some of the key explanations that we're seeing that support that outlook, somewhere like Australia, a couple of years ago had 0 gigawatt hours in terms of energy storage. We've seen year-on-year growth average around 200% for that market. The key things going on in this space is policy. There's a difference with EVs. Consumers can decide whether they want an EV. The difference with energy storage is we have to have energy storage. We have to have renewable energy, and the intermittency that brings requires that we institute batteries in our national grids to support that growth. That is not a choice, that's a reality, and we're seeing that play out in terms of the growth that we're seeing in this market. So it's one that I would really emphasize as one to look for. So where are we ending? We kind of started with a bit of a negative outlook. We were weighed more heavily to the downside. And if we look at that over the long term, some of the things that I think we're still going to have to work on. Pricing, with that metal price and the deficits we're expecting. Psychology, that's going to be a continual battle. If we look at places like the US and some of the ingrained issues there relating to the green transition. Charging and infrastructure, I would highlight, is kind of more middle of the road for the long term and needs a bit more growth. But the things that we're most excited about, the chemistry work and what that's bringing to the market in terms of range, policy, and the bullishness that we're seeing from emerging markets. And lastly, pricing for EVs spearheaded by the Chinese OEMs. So all of this work is located in our long-term forecasts, so you can come to me afterwards if you want any of this data or anybody on my team. And a final thing that I would kind of emphasize is I'm going to be leading the Diversity and Inclusivity Breakfast tomorrow at 7:30. It is for anybody and everybody. It's a cause that's really close to my heart. And we're going to be having a lot of really interesting conversations about how we make this industry as inclusive and diverse as possible. Thank you guys so much and have a great day.